make a start. Amy, if you're all right to start recording. And this is just notification for everyone that we'll be recording today. Okay. So welcome everyone. My name's Anna Hall. I'm the head of money and debt operations here at MAPS and responsible for all things debt advice. Thank you first of all for finding the time to come and join us this afternoon. We know that you are all very busy, so really appreciate you taking the time. As I mentioned, this session will be recorded. We've had a couple of people let us know that they will definitely be listening after the event, so we know that there will be some. So that's important that we then make sure that we record as much as possible, both in the breakout rooms and in the session we have. We won't be recording the breakout rooms separately, but we'll be taking notes and being able to share those afterwards. Cameras and microphones have been switched off for the first part of the meeting while the presentations are going on. But when we move into the breakout groups, they'll be switched back on. So for this session, for the first part, please do use the chat function to ask any questions that you have. We'll do our best to answer those at the right moment. So that might be while we're going through, or we do have an opportunity at the end to cover any off. Sometimes we have more questions than we can answer in the session, so we'll answer those after the meeting and then send them round afterwards if that's the case. So it's great to be able to run another one of these sessions for on the future of debt commissioning. We've not had one for a little while, but we've seen a fair number of you at events and other sessions that have been running. But it's great that we've been working hard behind the scenes. It's great to have some work for us to be able to update you on now. You'll see from the agenda up there that we're going to talk about the future commissioning strategy, so an update on our evidence gathering phase so far. Also an update on our advisor panel, which is going brilliantly. I'm delighted to have at least 2 members of the advisor panel with us today to talk about that. I think there might be some others also joining as participants as well, so it's great to see you here. Thank you. Also be giving an update on the research that we've been undertaking. So we've got some key findings from that we want to share with you, and then we'll go out into breakout rooms and then have a chance to feedback and have some reflections and Q&A at the end. So yeah, so set questions whenever you like. We'll try and get to those as soon as we can. So I won't go on. I will pass over to Fiona.
Thanks, Anna. So as Anna mentioned, we've run a couple of these events previously, the aim of which is to kind of keep you updated with the work that's going on to develop our future commissioning strategy. But before we get into the content of the presentations, we thought it'd just be really helpful to get a better sense of who is with us on this call and what your involvement in the debt sector is. So Amy has just popped up on screen a quick poll, and it'd be great if you could click on the description that best describes your role within the sector. It just helps us get a flavour of who is on this call. So if you can click one of those options now, and Amy will let me know how it's going on. I'll just give you a couple of seconds more to do that. Fab. Amy, is it possible to bring up the results of that right now? This is where we find out hopefully the tech is working. Excellent. Okay, brilliant. So that's quite interesting. We've got the majority of you have chosen something other as your main choice. So we'll have to have a little look at that. Quite a few of you involved in the management of services, but a good spread, an even spread actually, of community-based and kind of nationally telephone or digitally based results. So those of you who are here representing kind of the delivery side, so that's 24% of you who responded to the poll. When we come to the breakouts a little bit later on, we're really interested in hearing your thoughts and experience from the front line when we discuss the question that we're going to be looking at later on. So that's really helpful for us. Thank you. I'm going to kind of recap on the work that we're doing. So as Anna mentioned, we're running these events as part of the work to develop our commissioning strategy. And as we've set out previously, this is going to be a three-phase approach. Most of you on the call involved in the debt sector know that there are some significant pressures going on within the sector. So it's really important that the funding that comes through MAPS, to support the debt sector and provide services in England is spent as wisely as it can be to maximise the impact and support the sector really effectively. And so we're currently in the middle of our evidence gathering phase, and that will be followed by a consultation, formal public consultation. We're expecting to do that early in the next year. And then following that, there'll be a phase of commercial activity to put some new services in place based on the findings and the feedback from our consultation process. So this is where we are in our cycle. When we are thinking about developing the strategy and the areas that we want to consult on, these are the kind of key areas of investigation that we are interested in. So we're looking at things like what type of client should we be targeting, what mix of services, different types of services should we be funding, and questions along the lines of the ones that are up on the screen. The breakout that we're going to be running a little bit later on, what we're going to be doing in that one, you're going to really help us with the final question that's on that slide, thinking about the way that different services interplay and interact between each other. So we're using these sessions to help us with our thinking that is going into our consultation. Now, I've mentioned at these events previously when we've run them, that as part of the evidence gathering phase, we've commissioned some new research, but we're also using some existing and ongoing work that MAPS funds and is involved with. So things like our annual needs survey, which is something we do every year that helps us understand the different types of debt problems that people are facing and how many people need or could benefit from debt advice. We'll also be looking at our regular evaluation of the services that we fund, which is our Voice of the Customer survey, which looks both at customer satisfaction, but also does some longer, sort of medium to long-term impact work. So following people up 6 months after their advice and so on. So these are all going to be useful inputs. I wanted to flag an additional bit of research that we're just initiating, and that's a larger scale longitudinal study. And this is going to be a multi-year piece of work, so 3 years, potentially up to 5, following clients to really understand the long-term impact of debt advice on the outcomes for people. Now, this is a brand new piece of work. Unfortunately, we're not going to have the results in time to inform this consultation round, but it's just something that we wanted to draw your attention to, and it'll be a really useful piece of evidence and insight for the work that we do with the sector over the years to come. Now, when we've run these events previously, we've spoken to you a little bit about the advisor panel that we were planning to set up, and the intention there was to bring the voice of frontline advisors closer to the decision making at MAPS. And as Anna mentioned, we're really delighted that this is now up and running, and we've got 2 panels. We've got a smaller group who are meeting in person or virtually and working through some of the issues and ideas linked to our consultation and strategy development. And then a larger online panel who are supporting with sort of online survey responses going forward. Now, I could talk to you about how the panel's going, but we thought it'd be much easier and much more interesting to invite a couple of the panel members to speak to you. So Angela and Sean have joined, and I will hand over to them to tell you a bit more about how it's been going.
Hiya, I think I'm up first. So I'm Sean Finnegan. I manage debt advice service at Salford Council. It's part of a long-established welfare rights and debt advice service. I've been around for decades. Currently, we've got 8 debt advisors, and we deal with a lot of internal referrals from we're a public service available to anyone in Salford, but deal with a lot of internal referrals for quite vulnerable clients from adult social care, children's services, and so on. Both my interest in being involved in the panel kind of stems from working in local authorities. So I've spent most of my working life working in the similar roles in different local authorities, and I think sometimes local authority advice is kind of forgotten when there's discussions about sort of bigger picture of national services. So I kind of wanted to ensure that there's some representation for local authority services through the panel. In terms of the sort of meetings so far, so I think we've had 3 meetings. Meet up in Birmingham where we kind of set agendas and looked at the sorts of issues that advisors were interested in covering through the panels. And then we've had 2 meetings following up looking at specific areas. It's been very positive so far. So I think, you know, as an advisor, you feel like you're being listened to on the panel. There's kind of discussions which have been useful in terms of looking at things like advisor wellbeing, which services are funded by MAPS, and some of the sort of issues around MAPS contracts and the sort of pressures that advisors feel under through those. I think what worked quite well has probably been the range of advisors on the panel. So there's a wide range, obviously, you know, local authorities like myself, also a lot of MAPS funded organisations. I suppose, you know, a couple of examples of discussion I've had around advisor wellbeing. There was a lot of concern around volume of work, around sort of pressures on advisors to meet targets, to work in sort of particular ways, to tick boxes and that sort of thing was kind of a factor that kept coming up in that discussion from MAPS funded agencies. I suppose working in a sort of different type of service, my concerns around advisor wellbeing are probably slightly different, and things like the pressure on advisors from the changes in the types of clients that we're dealing with. So, you know, people who don't have as many solutions as perhaps they did in the past, the type of people who are referred in where, you know, when there isn't a solution, we get a lot of referrals in for people with quite severe mental health problems, people threatening suicide, and you know, those sorts of pressures build up on advisors. So it's kind of an interesting discussion. I think in terms of the purpose of the panel, to pick up on things which aren't quite as kind of introspective. So, you know, it's not just about issues for MAPS advisors, it's about issues for kind of the wider sector, and try to make sure that those things are considered, as well as the sort of the detail of how MAPS works and how MAPS contracts work. So like I said, it's been positive so far. I suppose the sort of what we'll see over time is how that's used by the pension service, and hopefully it continues to be kind of something which we feel listened to and can engage with decisions that are being made. And I'll hand over to Angela.
Hiya, so I'm Angela Newell. I'm the Financial Resilience Specialist at Great Places. We're a housing association. I've been doing this role now since about just over 18 months. Prior to being in the role, I'd never done any debt work at all. So it was all a bit new to me, really. So I had a vast knowledge of benefits. So within the organisation, we actually, there's 2 of us doing the role. All our clients come from internally, so it's referrals from either they call them neighbourhood service managers, which is the equivalent of like your housing officer, or it's the tenancy coach, or it's people that phoned in and said, I'm struggling, I don't know what to do. So then what we do is we do a lot of our calls over the phone, or we'll go out and see them, but we do have over 25,000 of properties, and like I say, there is only 2 of us. We're quite fortunate because we're not MAPS funded, so we're not targeted about the time that we can spend with the customer. We can spend a full morning or a full day with them if that's what it means to get them, to help them to resolve whatever it is their issue is. Been on the panel, I was really interested in going on the panel. So for one, because like I say, I'm new to the role, and there's only been 2 of us within the organisation doing this role, it gave me then more skills and knowledge for the future, really. So it was been a bit like helping me really as well. Since I've been on the panel, I've actually only attended 2 meetings because I wasn't available for the first meeting that was in face-to-face, but it's gave me a vast knowledge about what it actually means to be MAPS funded and how it affects the debt advisors out there that are MAPS funded. Because there's a vast amount of people in the group who are from different organisations, be it local authorities or been MAPS funded or working for charities or working for housing associations like myself. It's gave us where we can all put our heads together and see how does it affect us all, maybe differently, but in some ways the same as well, which has been really good opportunity. And what we've been considering on the panel is we've been considering about the debt advisors' well-being. That has been a high priority because especially with a lot of the customers that we're all seeing at the moment, you've got a lot of customers who have got deficit budgets, they're suffering with mental health, they've got vulnerabilities. And when you've got client after client and they're pouring all their woes onto you, it's quite draining really. And it's making sure then that not only are we helping the customer, but we're helping the advisor as well. It's a two-way process really. So it's ensuring that things are in place, so it's looking after the well-being of the advisor, and also to improve the pay and their conditions, because what some of them were saying about the conditions they were, it was like they'd got to do this and this to be able to meet the targets that they had to do. But then you're thinking, well, what about you yourself? Do you know what I mean? Is it really helping you? And that's what I found really interesting about that. So what we're hoping in the long run is that when it comes to like the funding they get from like the Money and Pension Service and wherever they get else to get the external funding is for, to ensure that the amount of funding they're actually getting is fit for purpose to enable to support the debt advisors out there that are MAPS funded. That's all I've got to say. Thank you very much.
No, thank you both for coming along and volunteering to share a little bit about your experiences today. I know, you know, we've certainly found it really enlightening to be having some of these conversations direct and to hear about the different experiences in different types of organisations. And certainly, you know, speaking personally, I've found the discussion really helpful in helping us work through different ways that we can start to evidence some of the decisions that we need to make, or different ways that we can present some of the information going forward. So really thank you both for coming along, and you know, look forward to working with you guys over the next couple of months as we do more work with the panel. We're going to move on now, and I mentioned earlier on that we'd commissioned 3 new bits of research, and this research is designed to help us during this evidence gathering phase. And I'm going to hand over to my colleague Andy, who's going to take us through some of the key findings from a couple of these bits of work. So Andy, if you want to switch on your camera and your mic.
Hello, hi everyone. My name's Andy O'Neill. I'm a Debt Development Manager here at Money and Pension Service, and I'm going to talk to you today about 2 of the research projects that we've had ongoing recently, and just give you a bit of a brief overview of what they were and a snapshot of some of the results. So the first one I'm going to talk about is the motivations and behaviours of people needing but not accessing debt advice. So what we were trying to establish here was 2 things. First of all, understand the problem regarding barriers and motivation when it comes to people seeking debt advice. So those people who are possibly in need of debt advice but are not seeking debt advice, to try and establish why. What are those barriers that's preventing them? And then to look at coming up with some recommendations on how could we overcome those barriers to make it easier for people to access the advice that they need. We've done this with a mixture of surveys, discovery interviews, and a simulation experience, which I'll come on to. And we involve people that we identified as in need of debt advice, along with a lot of stakeholders, including debt advisors and people associated with debt advice. So we move on to the first slide, please, Fee. Thanks. So based on the research, what we did, we developed a common user journey showing the different steps of the debt advice journey. So starting over on the left with the initial missed payment right through to post-debt advice appointment, which is the other end of the journey. And what we did was we divided it into two distinct stages. So we've got pre-debt advice on the left, and then we've got seeking debt advice on the right. And what we found was that people regularly move in between those steps, depending on their circumstances. On to the next, please, Fee. So the data from those initial surveys helped us to identify a number of barriers, but there was 4 in particular that seemed to affect every step of the journey. So the first one was that people were feeling embarrassed about struggling with their bills and having debts. Another was that people were finding it overwhelming to think about, having to deal with the debts. And then the other 2 were that people with vulnerabilities often have low literacy and confidence. And also those people with vulnerabilities, if they were juggling multiple challenges, debt was not always a priority on their list. So the motivation to actually seek debt advice wasn't actually there. And what we found with these 4 barriers was these were present no matter what stage of the journey somebody was at. So these affected people right the way through the journey. So they were the 4 main ones that we initially identified. And then we also identified 7 other barriers, but these barriers seem to be more prevalent along certain points of the journey rather than right the way through like the previous ones. So these range from people not identifying themselves as having debt, which you can see is one of the first ones there when there's been a first missed payment, right through to the opposite end where people actually didn't like the solution that was offered to them when they had that debt appointment. And as you can see, there's several in between, things like finding short-term solutions. So people had spoke to a creditor, they've got a short-term solution, and in their minds, the problem's been resolved. So as a result, they didn't go on to then seeking debt advice. So at this point, what we've done is we've got the user journey and we've established some of those main barriers that people were facing that was preventing them from actually going and seeking debt advice. So based on those insights, what we did is we looked at some potential solutions, and there's 2 in particular that I want to speak about today. So what we did is we created a simulation experiment. So we had a number of participants go through a journey where we gave them 6 triggers along the way. So ranging from an early trigger, which is the missed payment, and then that gradually getting more serious, like creditors are now contacting and you're getting threatening letters. And after each trigger, there was a variety of options of what that participant can do, one of which would be to now seek debt advice. And we wanted to see whether or not by introducing a couple of these concepts, would that have an impact on how quickly somebody actually seeks debt advice? So we separated the participants into 3 groups. We had the control group where there was no solutions included. They just went through the journey and went through the triggers. And then we had another 2 groups where we introduced one of these solutions into each. So the experiment was to see, would these solutions have an impact on encouraging clients to seek debt advice? And the first one we looked at is this, which is the journey map. So this was a journey map where participants were able to see a map of the debt advice journey. And that was to help give them a better understanding of how debt advice works. And also to be able to see that they've got autonomy when it comes to choosing a debt solution. So this was kind of in response to a lot of those initial insights. So we had things like people saying they were worried about what will happen during debt advice. They didn't understand what the procedure was. People thinking they might have to relinquish control of the finances if they were to seek debt advice. And a worry that they would have a solution forced upon them. So this was introduced to try and appease those concerns. And then the second one on the next slide was a money health checker. So this is where participants answered a few simple questions about their money health and then were signposted to sources of support and information. And it was hoped that this solution would kind of raise awareness to that participant. They've actually got problem debt. And again, it was based on those initial insights. So thinking about Some people were saying that they thought other people were worse off than them, so they weren't going to seek debt advice. A lack of awareness about what available debt advice there is, and also a lack of insight into their own financial situation. You remember on one of the previous slides, people saying they didn't consider themselves having a debt problem. This was to try and give them that overview of their issue, so they knew, oh, actually, maybe I do need to seek advice. So we had the 3 groups, the control group, and then the 2 encouragement groups with the money health checker in one and the journey map in the other. So on the next slide, you'll see some of the results. So what you'll see is, regarding the journey map, those participants that were exposed to it were more likely to seek debt advice at an earlier point. So you can see on the graph there, the first 2 triggers was really successful. So trigger 1 and trigger 2, those who with not just the journey map, but with the money health checker, but more so the journey map, more people than the control group, a lot more, sought debt advice at that early point. So it definitely had an impact at that point. But what we did see is, as the experiment went later and we got to the later triggers where the triggers were getting a little bit more serious, they didn't really have as big an impact. So we could see that both of those encouragements had an impact early on in the simulation, but it was in those initial stages, which is when they first missed the payment or the creditor first contacted them. And obviously, having been involved in debt advice for many years, that's when we want people to come to us anyway, isn't it? We want them to come earlier so we can try and get a grip of the issue before it escalates. So that was just a snapshot of that particular research. We're still looking at the analysis. Hopefully it gives you a flavour of what we did with that. The second piece of research I'm going to talk about is debt clients and landscape post-pandemic. So this was a piece of research that was established to see how the debt advice sector had changed since COVID. So looking at both debt clients and the debt advice landscape. So particularly looking at what are debt clients' needs now, and obviously given the pandemic, cost of living increase, and also how debt advice services are currently operating. There was a lot of changes made during the pandemic, as we know. Are those changes still in place? Are they still meeting the needs of the client? So this was done a number of research ways, including site visits, client and debt advisor interviews, and interviews with creditors. And as you can see, the first sort of section to talk about was customer need. So what the research shown was that the pandemic and cost of living increase has resulted in people seeking debt advice. Now, that's not going to come as any surprise to any of you. But whilst we did see the types of client remain similar, there was 2 groups that became more prominent. So those were clients in the lower income scale were presenting with more complexities, things like deficit budgets, which again isn't going to come as a surprise to whenever we've been talking about deficit budgets for a while now. Concurrent vulnerabilities, so things like financial abuse in particular, we definitely had, the research has shown there was a big increase in that. And there was feedback on this kind of last door open situation. So there was reports of there was other agencies, other support networks that was no longer available, resulting in the need for giving more holistic advice. Almost like a lot of the organisations who responded was like, we're now a one-stop shop. They're coming to us with everything. So that was obviously a big change. The other group we identified was an increase in middle-income customers. So many of them had reported they'd never had problem debt before, they'd never sought that advice before, but many of them were finding themselves in this position for the very first time. And the research suggests that a lot of things had caused that, things like rising interest rates, a lower stigma regarding money problems, and an increased awareness regarding problem debt, meaning a lot of customers saying for the first time they felt a little bit more anxious about their financial position, so decided they wanted to seek that advice for the first time. The other area we looked at was service delivery and how this had changed over recent years and what it kind of looks like now. And what we found was that hybrid working is now in place with many organisations. And whilst there's a lot of positives to that, it's not without its challenges. So what the data was showing us that hybrid working gave a lot more flexibility to not only advisors, but to clients as well. And it also helped with a better work-life balance for staff. But there were some reports that some staff felt like they were less supported when they were working remotely. So it's got its positives and its negatives on that side. It also shown that digital channels were rapidly adopted during the pandemic. As we know, we all had to change our standard working procedure. And most organisations have actually maintained them and now offer an omni-channel service. But what the research did show is that these were not always being utilised strategically. So although they've remained in place and available, there wasn't always a clear plan or strategy as to how organisations were going to utilise those paths. So again, just a quick snapshot of those two research streams, and I think I'm handing back to Fiona.
You are, Andy. Yeah, thanks. It's a bit of a kind of rattle through, and I'm going to follow that up with a rattle through the third piece of research that we've been conducting. Now, this one's slightly different to the two that Andy has been talking about, because this one has been much more focused on kind of organisations and stakeholders rather than customers. So this is a piece of work looking at the funding and operating models of debt advice. And we wanted to get an independent voice to help us paint a picture of the sector that we are working with when we commission services. And we wanted them to gather some insight about funding pressures within the sector, about how different operating models were being utilised, and to explore some options that we might consider when we're developing our future strategy. And we really wanted this to be a kind of independent space from MAPS, which is why we worked with a third party on it. It's a really comprehensive bit of work. They spoke to significant numbers of stakeholders across England and within the nations. And, you know, I'm just going to give you a quick kind of précis of the key findings from this piece of work. So the themes that we wanted to draw out, looking at different funding sources within the sector. And it was really interesting, just the range and diversity of funding sources. We spoke earlier to Sean, who's working in a local authority area, with Angela, who's working for a housing association focused on working with those residents. And so this picture of the funding that is out there within the sector is you know, very diverse and very different. And what really came out from this research is the different types of pressures that there are for organisations working on a national basis and organisations working locally. And so when we're thinking about commissioning services and how our funding can add the most value within this range of different organisations, you know, there's some really useful stuff for us to think about in how we can act as a national commissioner, but think about how local services work. So, you know, we've picked up a kind of thread of investigation off the back of this about talking to kind of other funders of advice to look at ways of working potentially with them. The agency who did the work for us do lots of consultancy support in within local authorities and different kind of services, and they said they were really surprised just at the range of different delivery models that were out there. It's quite unusual. They felt that the advice sector actually was so diverse compared to a lot of the other public services that are out there. And again, you know, that's a really interesting thing for us to think about and work through, about how do we get a kind of national approach to commissioning when what's happening on the ground varies so much from local authority area to local authority area. There's also a third thread that I wanted to pull out on this work that picks up on some of the things that Andy was just speaking about really, you know, the needs of clients within what we're funding. Now, should we be commissioning something that takes a very narrow and focused view of what debt advice is, or if the evidence suggests that wraparound support is essential to make sure clients are getting the debt outcomes that we want them to receive? You know, should we be pushing the boundaries of what we're able to fund, and how can we work in a way that maximizes the impact of the spend that we have? And the final kind of thread of this work was really thinking about, you know, the way that we commission services and making sure that the commercial approach that we adopt for any future commissioning is in step and aligned with the capabilities that are within the sector. So, you know, so very quick kind of summary of what is a comprehensive document. The 3 bits of research are going through our final internal sign-off processes at the moment, so they're not available as final reports just yet. When they are, we'll let you know and we'll publish them. But we're really happy to have a discussion and a conversation with anyone who's interested to know a bit more about these bits of work in the meantime. So we're going to move on now, and I think roughly on time, which is great, to move on to our breakout sessions. And my colleague Christy is going to explain how we're going to run these.
Yes, indeed. Thank you, Fiona. And hi, everybody. I'm Christy McAleese, Debt Strategy and Policy Lead at MAPS. And so as Fiona referenced at the start of the presentation, one of the conversations that we've been having and sort of the issue that we've been thinking about is that if it's the kind of right approach that MAPS has a mosaic of different services from kind of place-based, community-based services offering elements of in-person support through to our nationally accessible services, which kind of provide via telephone and digital, we will always have, we're kind of thinking a bit about how we make sure that those services are more than the sum of their parts. And one of the things that we're thinking about is the question where if someone presents at one of those services but actually could be served better somewhere else, so say someone's in the queue for a community-based service but actually they have the kind of right skills and capability to get a really, really good outcome from one of our nationally accessible services, or vice versa, how can we ensure that they're getting to the right place to meet their needs? So we've set out a bit of a scenario, and this is, I guess, directed to our colleagues on the call who are our debt advisors themselves, but we're expecting that lots of people will have ideas and insight that they can share as well. But particularly speaking to our debt sector colleagues at the moment, thinking about a client that you've worked with recently who at some point during the client journey you recognize that they would have been better served by a different debt advice organization. And as I say, it could be because they had support or access needs that you could not effectively meet at that time, or they had a debt advice need that you felt would be better served by another organization, or you recognize that actually they would have been able to achieve the same outcome that you could have provided to them, but sooner or by accessing another debt advice provider. We want you to talk to us a little bit about what you did for that to get that client to the service that you felt was more suited to them. Did you experience any barriers or blockers in doing that? And what did you have to do to work through them? And once you made the referral or the signpost, were you actually confident that they got to the service that you sent them to and continued their journey there? So what's going to happen is we will put you automatically into breakout spaces. There'll be MAPS facilitators and some note takers in each room. I'll be there in one of them. We'll talk for about, I think, 20 to 25 minutes, and then we'll come back into the room, do a bit of feedback, and then we'll have time for sort of other questions as well. So hopefully the kind of electronic magic will happen shortly, and we'll see each other in some breakout spaces. In 10 seconds, there we go. See you all shortly.